So yeah, we've basically broken it down to these three steps. The first one being the recondition, which is what you see under number one. Number two is reinforce, and then number three, which is not listed here, but it's called rebuild.
I
Right?
couldn't find that one, so I just stuck the mega mucosa.
Okay, perfect. So think about mega mucosa as step number three, which is rebuild. Now, again, people are unique, dynamic, different. This is just a very general outline of what you could do. But in many cases, we do adjust the steps depending on the person's particular condition. But the idea here is that when you look at the literature and you look at what we call the pathophysiology of barrier dysfunction, right? That's a very fancy way of saying how leaky gut happens. When you look at the pathophysiology of it, it starts with dysbiosis, right? So it starts with a change in the microbiome. And that change can be characterized in a few different ways. One is typically you see a lowering of diversity of microbes in the gut, right? So as you start to see a shrinking of diversity, you start to see an increased risk for leaky gut. Number two, you start to see a lowering of the keystone strains that are really important in maintaining these structures. So these keystone strains actually provide the building blocks, the triggers, the stimulation for repairing the mucosa, repairing the intestinal epithelium, and so on. Because here's what's really interesting about it, right? We have this critical structure that I showed you, these various mucosal layers, the tight junctions in between the cells, all of these things that are supposed to be functioning appropriately, and all of the structural components of those in terms of repair and restoration come from signals from the microbiome. So we can't really induce the repair of those things ourselves. So we need the appropriate microbes in place in order to be able to fix any of this stuff. So that's where we've shifted our focus from what was typically done in functional and natural medicine. We've gone to the focus that, hey, wait a minute, this all starts with dysbiosis. It starts with a certain characteristic dysfunction in the microbiome, which means that we have to fix that first, right? So that's where the recondition idea comes from. The idea is that we have to recondition and change what the microbiome looks like. We have to bring back diversity. We have to increase the keystone strains. If there are pathogens that are known to eat away at that mucosal layer, which is one of the ways that leaky gut starts, then we have to control those pathogens. We have to create competitive exclusion. So your commensal good bacteria will have a chance of bringing down the population of those pathogens. So then the idea is step one, recondition, we got to start fixing the dysbiosis. And as we start fixing the dysbiosis, we want to make those changes more permanent. And that's where we go to the reinforce. So the idea is that we're reinforcing this new microbiome distribution that you have in your gut, this increased diversity, this increased keystone strains, the lower levels of pathogens. That increase, that change in the microbiome has to be reinforced so that it becomes more of your permanent looking microbiome. Because if not, the microbiome can continuously fluctuate back and forth between characteristic functionalities, and you may start to resolve the leaky gut for a moment, and then within a week or so start going back to having dysbiosis and disproportionate leaky gut. So then once we change the microbiome, then we provide the microbiome with the really important tools to bring down the inflammatory response in the mucosa so the mucosa can repair, to provide the mucosa with the building blocks that it needs, the 4 key amino acids that it needs to rebuild that mucosal layer, and then also to change the immune response within the mucosa itself. Because if there is continuous toxicity, if there's continuous inflammation in the mucosa, the gut lining can't repair at all. So that's why we have this general recondition, changing the microbiome, reinforce those positive changes, and then finally rebuilding the microbiome. But again, we do switch things around depending on the person's case.